Japanese history. There used to be this great honey empire, or honey. Uh, it was a Chinese and Japanese empire, and they used to have this great big huge honey boat. It was like 400 feet long or something like that. This great big huge honey barge, basically they called it, and pretty much had an all-female crew and some male, but mostly it was an all-female crew. And the Chinese or Japanese really, I don't really like to call them Chinese. I mean, realistically, they're Japanese. I name them Japanese or whatever. And it might have to do with the Japanio or whatever like that. Not exactly sure, but basically they also sold spices and stuff like that. But anyway, though, but basically they're Orientals, and they used to have this great big huge ship. Like it was like 400 feet long, and they had beehives on it. They called it the honey ship because it had, people call it the Huns or whatever like that, but basically they're Chinese. And they used to paddle these little things up into the rivers, and they would move the ship away from the cold, and they would, move it around, and it would stay near the shore usually, and they'd even use great big wooden poles to push it along. It didn't even really need sails. But basically, a bunch of Chinese and maybe some other people. Basically, they paid out money. I knew them because I owned it, and basically they would take these beehives up into the channels and stuff like that. And this is back in the old days when they used to also anchor barges in a river stream, and they would anchor them down, and then they would use them as a sawmill. And this is the Chinese and the Japanese, and they also sold fine silk and a whole bunch of other things. But basically, it was known as the honey ship. And basically there's a bunch of women on it and stuff like that, and some men, and they were pretty well off and pretty rich, and they always had food and honey basically, and they would take their honey hives around, and they would get money for stuff because citrus and all that, a lot of plants need the bees to pollinate. So they would keep the bees alive basically and do all this and do all that, and move the bees around. And anyway, though, they were pretty rich and pretty well off, and they were basically the Japanese-Chinese empire, pretty much. And they always had honey. And they sold it, and everyone liked the honey, and they also make little candy things off the honey. But they also had, timber mills and stuff like that. Anyway, though, what happened to it basically is pretty much someone snuck aboard, basically, and raped all the women on board and killed all the men. Like I say, I can only assume it's Mr. Brown or Mr. Black or the Blacks, basically. But pretty much they snuck on board to steal all the money and everything else like that. And they pretty much raped and killed everyone. And then basically set it on fire and sank it, pretty much. And the little ships, because every night the ships would take they'd have to wait until the bees came back into the hives. And then they would row up the stream, back towards the thing if they're going to move. They usually stay around there for about a day or two, to kind of let the bees go out and get all the pollen and everything else like that. But then they would go back in, and go back to the mothership, to the big ship. And when they were coming back in, they could see the fire off in the distance, and that was the ship burning. And basically, those who did survive said that basically some people had snuck on board, pretty much raped all the women, and then killed them. And I think they kidnapped like 30 women or something like that. But basically, yeah, and stole all the money. But that's what happened to the honey ship, and that was a Japanese-Chinese freighter. And basically, 4,000 people went to the bottom that day, or something like that. It was like 1,000 some odd hundred. It was a big ship. It was like 400 feet long and had a bunch of crew. And there was like 3 other ships there too. Anyway, they were hit hard. There was only one little ship left, basically, or something like that. It should be in the Japanese-Chinese archives, somewhere about the honey ships and the honey. And basically it was like the Ming dynasty or one of those dynasties. Anyway, though, it was a really sad maritime disaster, pretty much. It was the LS Honey, or Lucifer Star Honey. Anyway, my ship, basically, but, I loved those people. And it was really sad what happened to them, and I was really upset, when I heard that someone had actually taken out the ship, because they were just women and children, and some old people that were manning a ship for me, and they raped them and killed them and stole all the money. And it's like, they were just normal people, citizens, peasants, whatever. Good people too. They would always give out the honey if you were really hungry, and they tried to feed people, but You know, some people said it was for the food, but realistically, you know, they left the honey. Other people said they left the honey, they just burned the ship. You know, they just wanted the gold and the metal and stuff. So that's what happened to the LS Honey. You know, like I said, it was a ship of like 1,000, saw about 100 women and some other people. But basically, you know, it was pretty much a horrible disaster.